Coach Schumann here with Shelby Stanger. We're back for the Success for Life podcast. We've had like a little 2-week hiatus here as I kind of really got into my week off this week. I've been real busy, but we're back in action, and I have a very interesting and special guest today, and we're going to talk a lot about some different lifestyle choices and being able to live your own lifestyle. And Shelby is really the perfect person to talk to about that. So anybody that's out there that's looking to really not just be an entrepreneur, but also live the lifestyle that they want to live, choose that lifestyle. Shelby is the person. She has her own podcast. She lives the style of life that she wants to live. She's out in San Diego, California. You can't be that. So without further ado, I'll introduce Shelby and let her tell you a little bit about herself.
Well, thanks, dude, for having me on. Yeah, I've worked in the action and outdoor sports industry since I was 16, and as a journalist and in marketing and sales. And in 2016, I've always loved storytelling. I did it since I was 16. I can tell you a little bit about how I got started. But I've always loved stories about adventures, especially those who've taken the road less traveled and had the courage to kind of go out and pursue their own wild ideas. So in 2016, I started the Wild Ideas Worth Living podcast. And this year it's presented by REI Co-op, which to me is like the best retailer, sponsor, company to help get people outside going for their wild ideas.
Yeah, REI, obviously they're everywhere as far as from an outdoor standpoint, and that's where you go to get your stuff for the outdoor. Now, we talked offline briefly, and I think you really have an interesting background. You were an athlete yourself. You played college sports. You played soccer in college. How did that kind of influence you to kind of go into the outdoor space?
Yeah, it's so as a kid, I grew up playing soccer. I think I also learned how to surf when I was 12. And I think if there had been an opportunity for me to pursue surfing as far as I could have pursued soccer, soccer was organized, it was safe. My mom could drop me off at practice. I probably would have pursued surfing, but soccer was awesome. It also taught me a lot about teamwork. And I'll just be honest, I was a goalkeeper, and I'm not really built like a goalkeeper. I'm 5'4", and I can run fairly fast for a goalkeeper. But I like being the goalkeeper when it comes to business. Like, I always have liked jobs where I'm sort of independent and have this like weird position, but also have a team in front of me. So yeah, I think sports teach you about determination, perseverance, teamwork, and you have to show up sometimes when you don't want to show up. So I grew up playing soccer. I ran track in high school. I did a little bit of track in college. I ran the mile. And then all of a sudden, my sophomore year in college, I did an internship where I interned at a newspaper in South Africa, and I had my weekends off. And that was just eye-opening. I mean, it was a weekend without a dirt track or a green soccer field. And what I did in South Africa was I covered adventure. I wanted to see how many adventures you could do in one day in South Africa. So that was a story. I knew I would have to cover, it was 1999, so apartheid had ended a few years before. It was still pretty rough in South Africa. And I knew I'd have to cover AIDS, race, drugs, all sorts of heavy issues anyway. So I wanted to cover sports. And this is sort of a long answer, but long story short, I got into outdoor sports because in South Africa, I realized that you had weekends free, and I started doing all these outdoor activities. I started going mountain biking. I surfed on the weekends. I went sandboarding. And when I came back to Emory, I enrolled in this club called Outdoor Emory, where they would hike the Appalachian Trail, and all these weird through hikers with these funny names would come through. And I just got hooked. I'd never really done a lot of camping as a kid. I'd done some surf camping, but that's pretty different than hiking on a trail. And I just love, I guess, the peace that outdoor sports brings. I think that when you're outdoors in nature, you can learn a lot of lessons. I think all sports can teach you a lot of lessons. For me, my biggest sport has always been surfing, and I've made my best decisions in life, not from a pro-con list on a piece of paper, but the times I've been surfing and something happens, or when I've been on a hike and something happens, or I know this is a little bit of a ramble, but I mean, some of my best decisions have come from the outdoors, and I can get into specifics, but that's kind of how it went.
I'll tell you a funny story. So I'm going to give you my surfing story. So
that sounds great.
This is good. So I went for years. I used to take, because I run football events and showcases and a lot of different things with related to football specifically. And then I used to take in the summer, because as things would wind down before I would start coaching football, I would take like a vacation, different places. And one year I went to San Diego, was one of my vacations for like 5 days. I was by myself, so I went on these different adventures. And one of my things was I was going to go and learn to surf. Okay, so this is about, I don't know, maybe it's about 7, 8 years ago, something like that. Now I don't know if you can tell on screen, but I'm a big guy. So I'm about back then I was probably about 260, but right now I'm about 275. So awesome. I went in, I said, let me go and learn to surf. But I've always been a very good athlete, so I figured I could hopefully get myself up. So I go into the, I come down to La Jolla. They have all the surf camps going on.
That's where I taught surfing for years, at Surf Diva. Were you there?
So I went there, yes.
Awesome. So I was a Surf Diva instructor forever.
Really?
Yeah, it was started in my house. The woman who started it, Izzy, is my best friend. And I mean, tell your story and then I'll tell you.
This is wild. So I go and now the surf instructor I had was a young kid. He might have been, he may have been like 18, 19. I don't know. He could have been in high school. I'm not sure exactly, but he was young. And so as I'm coming and he sees me coming, because I'm a big guy, and he sees me coming and he realizes that I'm there to, get a lesson or a couple lessons. And, as I'm walking, I see all these kids, okay? Like literally, some of them might be as young as like 6 years old, 5, 6 years old, to high school kids. And they're surfing, they're getting up. I see how the kids are using like 2 knees to get up and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this should be no problem. These little kids can do it. I certainly could do it. So I get there and he goes, well, you look like you're a pretty strong guy, I'm going to teach you the right way to learn. So, to really pull yourself up and stand, right? And not taking 1 knee, 2 knee or anything like that. So I'm thinking, all right, maybe I could go and learn. So we start like on the beach, right? And so obviously that part's not that hard, but I learned kind of the proper way to do it. Then it comes time to go into the water. Now he probably was about, I would say he was maybe like 5'10", 155 pounds, maybe 160 pounds.
A lot of surfers are lean.
Right. So he takes me into the water. He's got to manage and help me, who's obviously significantly larger than him. First of all, I had to get into this wetsuit. Getting into the wetsuit was an adventure in itself. And he gives me this ginormous board, okay, which might as well have been a paddle board, but it was a ginormous board. And I'm like, wow, this may not be as easy as I thought. So I spent like basically the next 2 hours trying to get up. By around an hour and a half in, I actually got up like several times and actually kind of rode a couple of waves. So it wasn't that bad. And then I was going to come back the next day. So, I know it was difficult. I kept trying to get up over and over again. The next day comes and I woke up and I was like, holy cow. I couldn't believe how sore I was. And I had to reschedule for the next day because I'm like, I could barely move. And especially my hips and my abs. And it was like nothing I ever experienced. So I learned, then and there, like, to make sure that you're mentally prepared for everything that you go and do, because not only I had a great time learning it, but it was such a challenge. So I immediately had tremendous respect for surfers from that point forward. Like anytime I see it on TV, I go, you have no idea how hard that is to learn. And if you're gonna learn, you gotta learn at a young age.
It's way harder than it looks. Actually, this wave behind me,
Yeah.
This is the wave you learned on. That's actually La Jolla Shores on a really big day in the winter.
That's unbelievable.
So, yeah, I actually learned when I was, so I'll give you like the meat of the story. So when I was 11, my dad was a dentist, parents were married, and he died of a sudden heart attack. And it was really tragic for my family. But after that, I learned to surf. I went to camp that summer. My sister got me a surfboard. And I think that surfing really helped me with grieving. I mean, in surfing, one, it's social, you're in water. There's a lot of things that come at you that don't have any answers. And it's really peaceful. And so surfing to me was my favorite sport. And I went to this camp and I had all these great guy instructors. And then I had this instructor named Izzy. And she had a lot of guys who liked her, and she spoke fluent French and Spanish. She ended up starting Surf Diva. And my mom ended up remarrying this great guy who was an athletic director. And she rented a studio off the back of our house and started this surf school. And so I taught surfing there for years. I'm actually a much better surf instructor than I am a teacher. And what's really cool is I've taught women to surf all over the world of all ages, and men of all shapes and sizes. And I think whatever fears people have in life, if they kind of learn to surf and get over their own fears in water, they start getting over their own fears on land. And so I'll just tell you the story. So I went to Emory. I actually started writing as a journalist when I was 15. A teacher said, hey, we'll give you extra credit if you turn in your essay to the Union Tribune. If you win the contest, you get an automatic A for the year. So at 15, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do it. I won this contest writing a story. And the next year I started writing for a national magazine. I was 16. I wrote about a family member's battle with alcoholism. And a kid at soccer practice came up to me. She had read the magazine article and she's like, Shelby, I shared this with my boyfriend. Last night was the first time he didn't drink. And so at 16, 15 years old, I learned how far words could go. And I was like, I'm going to be a journalist. I played soccer. Soccer was my ticket to college. I thought I had decent grades, but I thought soccer was my ticket to college. I ended up going to a Division III school, the only D3 school I'd applied to. I think the other goalkeeper at the Division I schools were all way taller than me, and I would have sat on the bench, to be honest. So right. I wanted to run track and play soccer, and I also kind of wanted to be a college kid and party and have fun and volunteer. And Emory was the perfect choice for me. So I went to the school back east, played soccer, and I interned every summer. So if there's kids who listen to your podcast or college students, I would recommend to internship. And if anybody wants to be a journalist, a writer from Esquire, who was one of my professors my freshman year of college, said, hey, intern at a local newspaper. And so I interned at a local newspaper who had covered my soccer career. And the second week I was there, they teased me and they're like, hey, you made a big error on page 5. And instead they'd put my picture and gave me my own column. And they said, hey, what do you want to write about? And so I decided to write about surfing and adventure sports. And so at 19, I had this surfing adventure column in these local community papers, and I had to find people to interview, did the stories, and I'm really kind of doing the same thing today. I'm finding adventures and talking about them just in a different format. Another summer, I interned at that newspaper in South Africa, which is where I discovered kind of my love of more outdoor sports rather than traditional mainstream. I do love mainstream sports, but I don't know. I kind of love these other sports.
Right.
I love sports in nature. I think that's just, for me, that's the ticket. And I interned at CNN. And then after college, I got a job as the journalist for the Vans Warped Tour, which is a punk rock music festival that goes to 60 cities. And it's sort of a long story about how I got the job, but to keep it short, I'd met a guy who did PR at Vans while I was working as a journalist in Atlanta, and I kept in touch. And I think there's a lot of power in keeping in touch with people, writing snail mail, and you just never know what's going to happen. I was looking for a job after college, and they had an opening. They'd never hired a woman. They were a little nervous because it required living on a tour bus on a tour that was mostly men at the time. And so my job was to basically blog before it was called blogging. I wrote a story a day about the tour, and then I had to take 100 pictures and then somehow find a way to send them through a dial-up connection. There was no Wi-Fi. So that required hitchhiking with the most non-axe murder looking like teenager, begging him to take me to his house or to Kinko's and promising him backstage passes. and
That's crazy.
Yeah, and then end up at the bus before it left for the next day without getting murdered or kidnapped. And I don't know, but that's what the Warped Tour was. So that was my first experience out of college. Was I got paid too. I got like $600 a week to do this job. I was fed, and I interviewed punk rock stars. And another mentor from Esquire, same magazine, said, hey, start with the guys who are in the background, the roadies, the guys who set up, and then interview the main bands. And that was really good advice. And I was terrified of the roadies. They had mohawks, scary. And here I am, this preppy kid from La Jolla. I was pretty naive. I don't have a tattoo. I totally lied and said I had one on my ass that says something inappropriate to get the job. But and it worked. I think having a sense of humor also will help you land jobs and also gets you out of a jam. So there was a lot of times on the Warped Tour where I was in a jam and I just said something smart and witty and I got out of it. But what I learned is that some of the scariest looking guys were actually the nicest and had some of the most compelling stories. And I really enjoyed interviewing the guys on the periphery almost more than the guys on the front. And then after that, I moved to Breckenridge, Colorado. I had all this confidence and I was this cocky 22-year-old who had just done the Warped Tour. And I was like, I'm going to be a snowboard journalist and live in Breckenridge, Colorado. And I also wanted to wait tables, which I had never done. I think everybody should wait tables who wants to be a storyteller because you learn a lot about people. And I was really lucky because the second day I was waiting tables, the host of the local TV show was in someone else's section. And they told me that they were waiting on him. And I was like, hey, I'll trade you. And I was a terrible waitress, but she traded me. And I went up to the guy and I said, hey, I love your TV show. I've hosted some shows before. I'd hosted like one show my whole life. And I said, I'd love to host with you. And he actually had a position open at the local station for an entertainment reporter, told me to come try out, and I got the gig. So I think I got really lucky early on in my career. I had a lot of confidence and I put myself in situations where I could succeed. And also I failed a lot, but I didn't care because I was young. Eventually I wanted to move back to California because I like sunshine and I like surf a little bit more than I like snow, although the mountains are beautiful. And I did some radio hosting as well in Colorado, which set me up for the podcast later on. But I came back and I got a job at Vans, the shoe company. And it wasn't in journalism. It was to do PR and marketing. And I was really reluctant, but it ended up being a really great position. I don't think I could get that job today. Vans is a lot bigger, but I ran all the women's marketing. And then I was in charge of Latin America, Australia, Asia, and a really big territory. And I learned a lot about business. But eventually in 2009, I started having some depression. I really wanted to be a writer and I wasn't writing. I felt like I was a shoe salesman at the end of the day. And Vans was a great company. I had an awesome job. And I felt really guilty about quitting. I felt like I was a spoiled millennial and ungrateful. And I started spiraling into this deeper and deeper depression. And I remember I'd go swimming by my house whenever I could. And I kind of secretly wanted to have a shark like bite the part of my head that just wouldn't. It was terrible. It's a terrible feeling. I ended up getting help for depression. It was really bad. And I decided to quit my job. But at the same time, I'd been freelancing at night. And I started pitching magazines. So anybody who's also wants to be a journalist or a storyteller, you have to learn to pitch. I took a how to pitch course and I had been pitching like ESPN, Outside. And one of the stories was on athletes that were really good at what they did, but they weren't sponsored. And in interviewing these regular everyday Joes that were total heroes, and like some of these guys were paddling from LA to Catalina Island, which is like over a marathon, running a marathon on the island, paddling back. And they had normal jobs as like real estate agents or lifeguards. And at the time you could only get sponsored. Remember like 20 years ago or 15 years ago, you're only sponsored if you're really good at sports. Today you can get sponsored for having a story.
Right.
Standing up for something you believe in, which is really cool. Back then you couldn't. So in interviewing these inspirational people, I started to get the courage to go out on my own. And I was like, you know what? Once I landed one story and Outside, I'm like, okay, that's all I need. I quit my job at the height of the recession. Everybody was like, you're crazy. And I started freelance writing. And I wrote, and the day I quit my job, I got a call to a PR person I had pitched earlier. She said she had an opportunity to meet one of the best surfers in the world in Indonesia and write about these guys surfing these giant waves. And I ended up doing this story, and I thought I was going to play the journalist card and say I couldn't surf these waves, because really I'd never been in waves bigger than La Jolla Shores, which don't normally look like this. They're normally a lot smaller. And I was in giant waves, and I had no choice but to drop in literally on these waves and in life. And so that was 2009. I was 29 years old, and I started to have a lot more courage after that trip. I met some people that told me to go for it, and it really gave me the courage to sort of go out and pursue what I wanted to pursue. Just to be completely honest, I didn't make a ton of money as a journalist. I never figured that out. So on the side, I always did marketing jobs, copywriting jobs, and I ended up getting really lucky. I worked with brands like Nike, because I understand triathlon, soccer, yoga, and all these other sports. So I worked with Nike, Prana, Body Glove, and that helped me pay bills. I also ended up writing about the business of the outdoor industry, which was great because I interviewed the CEOs of all of these action and outdoor sports companies and learned a lot about business directly from these amazing entrepreneurs and how they thought and why they made certain decisions. And then, I think I left this out. 2009, after I quit my job, I also taught surfing in Costa Rica. It was totally irresponsible. I'm like, I just got a really good degree from Emory. I worked at Vans, and now I'm going to go teach surfing in Costa Rica. What a jackass I am. And I was really terrified of what my parents would think. My parents are from the East Coast. They're pretty serious. My mom, a college professor. I was nervous what she thought, what she would think, but I ended up teaching surf lessons in Costa Rica, and I taught the head of NPR how to surf. I mean, I've made a lot of good connections teaching surfing. So I think if you fall, there's this cliche, do what you love and the rest will fall into place. I don't know if that's always true, but I think when you do what you love, you actually end up meeting people in really great settings. I'm really anti-networking and going to like a networking events. They feel very informal, and I don't like them, but I love meeting people naturally. In the water is a great place to meet someone. On a hike is a great place to meet someone. Running on the football field, what a great place to meet someone. If you tackle your next boss, like that would be such a great story. I don't know. I know I'm rambling.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. It's definitely fascinating. I think, some of the things that, first of all, your unbridled enthusiasm is fantastic.
Thank you.
And excuse me. I want to touch on so how you got to, what is it like to go and surf, and how does the adventure lifestyle enable you to really, especially for you, but any others that are like that, that enjoy it, how does it enable you to really put those thoughts together and really kind of connect with yourself, and connect with you as a person, which then kind of helps give you a clear thoughts as to what you want to really be, which I think you've done a great job of identifying. And it at least seems like you really have you're in touch with being able to understand, what your thoughts are saying to you around the surfboard, out, doing adventurous stuff, adventure activities, and then translating that into, what you're doing with your podcast, what you want to articulate to other people, the people you interview and such.
Yeah, I mean, I think surfing offers a lot of lessons in life. One is you have to let go of control. And I think a lot of us like to know exactly what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, where we're going to do it, with who we're going to do it with. And in surfing, you can't control Mother Nature. You can't control waves, and you have to learn to let go. So for me, I was a runner. I was pretty type A. I think surfing taught me a lot about letting go and accepting what is. The other thing is you have to learn to love getting worked. I mean, you got kind of worked surfing your first day. I get worked surfing every day. I got worked surfing this morning, and it wasn't even big. And so you have to accept failure a lot. And you start seeing failure as fun. So I think a Hawaiian guy told me, hey, you have to learn to love getting work and you have to laugh when you're underwater. And he said when I was underwater that I should sing a happy song. Not That'll Be the Day When I Die, which is the song I originally picked, but like something like My Sunshine. You sing a song when you're underwater, right, and you relax. And I think that's like a good metaphor for life is you're going to fail a lot and you kind of have to learn to sort of like when you don't always get what you want and then pivot. So like you might not get the best wave, but then you have to turn around and maybe there's another wave behind it. I think those are the biggest lessons from surfing. And then just the time in water is pretty meditative. I don't mean to go all hippie on you, but there's a lot of top performers I've interviewed and they have some sort of meditation practice. I've never been really religious, but to me, I guess I got a lot of my spirituality or meditative focus from the ocean. Because you have no choice but to like, surfing is a lot of sitting. It's not really surfing. You kind of sit and you wait for waves. And in between, your thoughts go all over the place and you get to decide what to do with them. Those help in business. Were you asking that? Am I totally going off tangent? I'm sorry.
You're dead on. So
Okay.
Failure, looking at it as fun. Like think about how hard that is for a lot of people. But I think
really hard.
I think it's so important because you learn from it. You improve from it. And then you also like laughing at yourself. So that's really the ability to look at something. And in business, I found that, especially some of the people that I've interviewed, everybody that is successful understands that failure is happening. It's going to happen. And I found that the people that tread in the middle, I always say the 9-to-5ers, okay, and there's nothing wrong with it.
No,
people,
I'm jealous of 9-to-5ers right now, actually.
Right.
I miss it.
Right, and knowing yourself is important because you shouldn't be an outdoor adventurist if that's not in your sight. If 9 to 5 fits your personality, that's a good thing. But being able to handle failure in every facet of your life and being able to have something that helps you cope. So I really do believe like meditation is real important. I try to do it as often as I can. It's a difficult thing, but it's something that puts you in touch. Like, one of the things I learned when I first came out of college, I played football. I got my MBA and went and worked in technology firm, and I was a fast riser in technology. And
nice.
And everybody would work and fight the urge when they got tired by filling themselves up with more coffee, right? Or whatever they did, whatever their vice was. And what I learned was to just take a nap. Take a short nap and take a time period off for 10, 20 minutes. And I would literally sit in my office and close my eyes. And I would take a 10 to 15 minute, time period out. Someone knocked at my door, obviously I'd answer it, but I would take 10 to 15 minutes, and I found that I could then work longer and more productively than anybody else. And I discovered this, kind of coincidence. I would try to fight it. I would do what other people were doing. I saw older people working, and I had a pretty stressful job right from the get-go. And it was during the whole tech boom, and I was an internet expert at the time. That was what my MBA was in. So way back in the late 90s, before a lot of people were in, I was already into that. And what was really interesting was I accidentally realized that I felt much better. Now I knew it in playing sports, like in football, I used to take quick naps before practice to give myself 20 minutes to feel better. I just applied what I did as an athlete to help me there, and I found that it worked there. So here was funny about it. What I found ironically was now I could work till people would be leaving at 5:30, and I could work till 7:30, get everything done I needed to get done. I was young, single, didn't have to worry about all these kind of things, and was able to work later. And what I discovered, which very few people in the first job I had knew, but I was there all the time, so I knew it. It was a 500-person company. The guy that hired me was actually an alumni of my college. He was on the board of trustees. I think he's now a billionaire, or close to it. And, but at the time his company was like 300 people, was worth like 30-40 million. And he would go and tour the offices at around the 6:37 p.m. every single night, just to see who was there working. And as an entrepreneur, I actually used to adopt that myself when I had my people that worked for me. I would do the same exact thing, but I learned from him. And he would go and he would just say hello to anyone that was still there. And more often than not, once I applied this thing, so I would be napping, if he came in at like 1:15, I might be actually on a nap. Okay. But I was there till 7:30 and he would talk to me, and I'd be like the last person on my floor, one of maybe two people. And he would sit there and he would talk to me. This is the CEO of the company. And he never talked to anybody. After he hired, he basically didn't talk to you unless he needed something from you at the time. And he developed this relationship with me. And he started to bring me to like all these boards that he sat on. He would bring me to the meetings as his personal person he was grooming. And it was, but he called it like the special assistant to the CEO. So it wasn't anything that would piss anybody off. That was my direct boss. He's like, this will be an extra job for you, but you'll be able to meet CEOs, and you'll meet CEOs of huge companies. So I did, and I learned so much from that experience. And it was basically because I applied what worked for my body instead of trying to do what everybody else did. And I did the same exact thing when I ended up leaving there after a year, and I took a job where they paid me $50,000 more a year at a tech firm in New York City, and then went and really helped build that business. And the same exact thing would apply. So I would, when I got tired, I would just kind of shut my eyes. I'd stay there late. The CEO of this company was a startup kind of company, but it was like we took it from like $2 million to like $15 million in a very short time period. And I was one of the rainmakers kind of there. And this guy would come down, and I never told him this, but this guy would come down at 7:00 not every day, but at least a couple times a week, just to check and see who was working and who wasn't. And same exact thing. 90% of the people, 95% of people were gone. And I was getting raise after raise after raise because I simply was, there working on my projects longer, and I learned to be able to make my time stretch. 20 minutes would give me 3 extra hours of work. And I learned something there. People who are at a very high level, who want to be successful, expect the people that they hire to adopt those principles. And it doesn't matter how you kind of get there, but adopting the principles of success is a common theme. And what I found is that the people that don't do that, they get weeded out pretty quickly. And a lot of people go their whole lives never understanding that, because they never stay past 5:30. They've never stayed past 5:30. And it's interesting, and I've read a lot of stuff about different executives that do that, where they get in early in the morning, they like to see who's there, and those kind of things. And in my space of football, you read all the time about NFL coaches or college coaches who, are in at 5:30 in the morning or in at 5 in the morning and are there late at night. And how are they able to do that? Well, most people can't work 16, 18 hours a day going straight through. So either they're cheating in some form or fashion, meaning something illegal or something with coffee excessively, or they figured out how to get in touch with their body so they can rest themselves to get more out of themselves. And I think that's my long-winded version of being able to understand that, and what I find so fascinating about how sports can do that, like surfing, even like hiking, and being able to get in touch with oneself to be able to understand your own body and what your own body needs.
Yeah. And what's really great, I love that story, by the way, is we live on the beach right now. So if I need 20 minutes to wake up, I can just jump in the water, catch 2 waves, and come back up. I'm really blessed. Like, we have a condo that's kind of falling apart, but it's awesome. And we're right across the street from the beach. And to me, that's like, this is like my palace. It's pretty small, but I don't care. We're on the beach. I think that you also learn so many other things when you're in the water. Like, one, if you want to catch a lot of waves and you're not very good, like me, you can talk to people and you're nice. And if you're nice in life, kindness gets you really far. And I'm not saying flirt for waves, which is probably what I did as a little kid. But I mean, I can't get away with that anymore. I'm just older.
Right.
But I think I'm just kind to people, and I give away waves, and then sometimes I get waves. The other thing is, in surfing, for me, I can't really compare myself to others. I was never a dancer. You know, to me, the best surfers are like dancers. They're just really graceful. I'm more of like a soccer player, and some soccer players are graceful. I wasn't one of those people that was blessed with a graceful gene. So comparison is really the biggest thief of joy. That's a lesson that I've learned in surfing. When I sit there and compare myself to other surfers, I don't have fun. So same in business. Like, I don't compare myself to other podcasters and what they're doing. I'm not sitting, I look at the charts, don't get me wrong, but I don't sit there and like stare at them and dwell at them. I try not to compare myself. So kindness, no comparison. These are two. And then the other thing is like sometimes in surfing, just like in football and other sports, you're uncomfortable and it's not easy. And I think there's a lot of growth that happens in times of uncomfort. So like,
there's no doubt about it.
Bigger waves, it's scary as heck, but once you've done it, you feel like you can conquer the world.
Comfort with uncomfortable is important in developing. I think some level of that is critical to what you're doing. Now, I wanted to, how you develop such a popular podcast, and as someone who also does podcasting, I find it really interesting. Everything you kind of have now really centers about, the people that you interview and the topics you covered, and then building that branding. So that personal branding, what did you do to really go about building that personal brand so that, the people who want to listen to your podcast can really relate to it, and you get sponsor like REI to get on board with you? What are the things that you really touched on that really developed your brand?
I think what I focused on first is the Wild Ideas Worth Living brand. So like if you go to shelbystanger.com, it was built in 2009. It hasn't changed. It needs an update. My personal branding needs an update. But Wild Ideas Worth Living, I think the biggest thing is I actually took an entrepreneurship accelerator course and wrote a business plan before I even started the podcast. And I built my listener in mind. Like I literally drew who I thought would listen to my podcast. I thought about what she would drink before work, how she would get to work, when she would listen to it, if she was married, if she had kids. I basically built my avatar. They talk about that a little bit in the podcasting world. Conversely, I knew it needed to be a business. A lot of podcasters have side businesses and they sell their side businesses or their full-time business through their podcast. For me, my business is just my podcast. So I knew I needed to get sponsors. So conversely, in this business plan, I drew my avatar for who my ideal sponsor would be. And I thought about what that person looked like, what they drank. I actually thought about REI. That was my main sponsor I wanted to pitch. And I built the podcast with that in mind. The other thing is I took advice from everyone else who said, just be yourself. I'm a really bad liar and I can't fake it. So, I told a couple penis jokes in the first couple episodes and that's just me. And I find them hilarious and some people might find them annoying, but some people are going to like you, some people aren't. Right. And you just have to be okay with that. For me, I really built the podcast I wanted to listen to. I loved listening to Tim Ferriss's podcast, but I wish there had been a podcast like that hosted by a female so I could relate to it, that talked a lot more about adventure and interviewed some of the athletic icons in the adventure world that I admired. And it wasn't being done. I saw nobody interviewing surfers and runners, which are sports that I like. And so I figured I would just do it myself. But like I said, I built, to answer your question, I built a business plan. I took this accelerator course. The very first day they gave us a business plan and they're like, okay, write your business plan. And I didn't have a lot of time to think about it because it was a 2-hour class the first day. And I mean, I revised it, but I've pretty much stuck to that business plan that I built the first day. Uh-oh, you're frozen. Hello? David, I'm gonna plug in. Hold on. Hello, hello, hello. 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 Should we keep going? Can you hear me? You're frozen. I don't know if I'm frozen. Should we try this again? Oh. Hello? So hot. Hello. Sorry, David, if you can hear me. Hopefully you guys can edit this part out. David? Hello? Hello? Uh-oh. hosted by a female, and where we interviewed people interested. I'm interested in tech, but I'm much more interested in adventure.
Right.
And I wanted to hear stories about adventurers who took the road less traveled. And I didn't see that being offered on iTunes. So I figured, no, this is actually what I do. Like, I've had tons of media experience, and in writing stories for magazines, I love the interview part. I kind of hate writing the story. So the podcast medium is like the best format for me. Plus, you don't mess up people's quotes. They get to tell their full story. And I loved that, just like you, I'm sure you can listen to podcasts in the car, while running, while cleaning. It's just such an awesome medium. And so I studied the heck out of podcasting, took this entrepreneurship class. Like, just, I've never immersed myself so much into learning one thing as much as possible. And then I did one thing that someone told me was really helpful. They're like, get to show 7, because there is something real called the podcast fade, which is after show 7, people die. Like, there's literally this graph where people get to show 7 and then they drop off completely, because running a podcast, I mean, as you know, anybody can do it, but absolutely. I think it's a lot harder than most people think it is. I can't believe, I thought this was going to be my side hustle, but it's my full-time hustle. It just takes everything. And I like it, but it's much more than just get to show 7 and you're on your way. Are you cutting out again? Sorry.
I can hear you.
Okay, cool.
I can hear you good.
Yeah, so the podcast fade is a real thing, and someone gave me that advice. Get to show 7.
A podcast feed. You know, I've experienced it myself as a podcaster. Like, you start rolling, and you're like I've had so many good interviews. Start rolling, and then if now obviously it's your full-time thing, but if it's not necessarily your full-time thing, like my thing, like, you know, I've had these like wild waves of super popularity, and it's interesting, but you're right. Like, after a while, like, you're doing them, and then you're like, okay, I'm looking, you kind of, you know what I think it is, at least for me, I'm looking for the next really interesting person to interview, right? So once you start to get really good interviews going, and then you have, like, you got to find the next interesting person, and you know, you're going to interview someone, and if you're not sure if they're that interesting, you're like, wow, like, how is this up in my ante? It's like,
yeah, I've had to let like at least 7 shows I've done this year just go. Where I did the interview, I drove to their house, I went to LA, and it just didn't turn out that great. So they didn't run. Yeah. Which sucks. And sometimes it's like really an issue of sound, and the sound was just bad. But yeah, I want to give my audience something that they enjoyed listening to. So I try my best to get really good guests, and I try to prep them and have them be able to offer advice, because I think that's what all of us want, is advice on how to be better.
Right. There's no doubt about it.
It's all about success and how to have a good business. I think one of the keys is also just hustle. Like, that never goes away. You have to hustle, but you have to take breaks. So this year, instead of doing 52 shows like I did last year and almost died 1 a week, I'm only doing 40 shows. So I did 1 a week for the last 6 months, and now I have so many breaks. So like this week we were off, and it was just so nice to have a week off of podcasting. I was able to catch up, and so now I can actually bankroll like 4 podcasts at a time, and I'll be a month ahead, which is awesome.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Do you think that podcasting, I guess it's like anything in the sense that when you see like my podcasting is always pretty popular in like the business entrepreneurship space. And I found that like everybody's trying to keep up with like the amount that, I don't know if you ever heard of Gary Vaynerchuk, but like amount of stuff like, Gary Vaynerchuk, everyone's trying to keep up with like as many podcasts as he turned out.
No way.
And like, you're just not gonna, because he's just taking everything that he has, he's turning into podcasts, no matter what it is, even if it's not an interview. So what you talked about being, you know, true to what you want to accomplish. I like how you had your you know, I've done business plans for my business, but actually developing that for your podcast and treating it like a business, I think is a critical part for anyone who wants to, you know, do what you're doing, have a chance to succeed, to treat it right from the get-go. And as to what you want your audience to be, who do you want your message to be, and who do you want to be your sponsors, I think it's really smart. I think a lot of people kind of do it the other way. They start rolling out the podcast. I know I did it myself. I start rolling out the podcast. I got interesting people to interview. And then all of a sudden I'm popular, and I'm like, wow, I think we should monetize this. Like, I'm monetizing my business, but how do we go and monetize this over here? I think your idea of like establishing that first, and then you could drive everything to that, I think is critical. Am I right?
Yeah, no, I think you're dead right. And I think you can do the Gary Vaynerchuk model where you release one a day, and obviously the more podcasts you release, if you have a sponsor attached to that, the more money you're going to make. But you have to be true to your audience. Like, my audience likes to run and surf, and they don't listen to that many. I think they have enough time to listen to like my podcast and a couple of others a week. And I don't see them listening to one a day. So you have to be true to that. But yeah, you have to creating a plan is helpful in life, having a goal, but you also have to be willing to change. So when I originally set out to do this podcast, I thought it was just going to be for women. I didn't think that men would want to listen. But the truth is I had been a journalist for mostly men's magazines before, and more men listen to podcasts than women. And 60% of my audience all last year were men. Now, when I have a woman on the show, it definitely skews more towards females. And I can't totally tell. I'm using Google Analytics from the stats that come to my website to guess. But it's pretty interesting. So yeah, I was like, I'm just going to have a show that caters to men and women. I'm not going to play the female card, I just want a show about adventure. I think that was more powerful. And I actually think sponsors really liked that I was a female without an agenda, just that I was hosting a show that empowered other people to go out and do whatever it is, no matter who they were, whether they were a girl, whether they were a guy, whether they were black, whether they were white, that it's a show for kind of everybody, but it's just about adventure.
Really cool.
Yeah, thank you.
What's the best? Who's the best? Like, so if someone wants to go through your podcast, who was the best interview that you felt you had?
Well, I can tell you the biggest show was definitely Cheryl Strayed. And I mean, that got picked up by Apple. They put it on the front page. She's the author of Wild, and she gives such good advice. She also has her own podcast. She's a pro at doing this, and just a great public speaker. And we actually talked about hiking now and how she hikes now and how she involves her kids. And I think she said something really poignant on the podcast. She said, the main thing she teaches her kids, she doesn't care if they're lawyers or doctors. She just wants them to be kind. And I think that message came at a time when a lot of people wanted to hear that. So she was awesome. But next week I have on Wim Hof. He's the guy, the Dutch Iceman, the guy who can hold himself in ice water the longest. And
oh, wow.
He climbed Everest 3/4 the way up with just a t-shirt. He's swam underneath polar ice caps, and he's this like wild maniac who teaches people breath, meditation, and commitment exercises to control their immune system and their body temperature so that they can submerge themselves in cold water. And he's really interesting. And he's a wild Dutchman. He was at a coffee shop in the south of France. I normally have more organized interviews. It's more of a loose conversation, but I think that's going to be really interesting. And then to follow it up, I interviewed a journalist who tried to debunk him. He's a journalist who debunks meditation gurus and people that claim that they can cure people and are just phonies and take money. He went out to basically debunk Wim Hof, did the method, and was like, oh my God, it worked. And the journalist climbed with Wim Hof Mount Kilimanjaro in like 29 hours or something like that without wearing a lot of clothes. They set the record. So that's the next podcast. So the next 2 weeks I think are going to be pretty
That's exciting. Cool.
Yeah, but I love interviews where guests can take away something. I had 2 different interviews about financial outlooks from adventurers. So one was author Jen Sincero, who wrote You Are a Badass at Making Money and You're a Badass. And she's actually a really big hiker who lives in New Mexico. And her whole philosophy is like, you can manifest making more money and doing the work, but you kind of have to dream big. The other girl I interviewed was a woman her blog name is Liz Frugalwoods, and her husband retired at like age 30. And they didn't have amazing jobs. Like he did work as a software engineer, I think. She just worked in PR for a nonprofit, so she didn't have a huge salary, but they saved like 60 to 70% of their income every year, were incredibly frugal, and at 30 bought a house in Vermont in the middle of the woods on a bunch of acres of land, and they have 2 kids. And so they took a different approach, whereas like just like less stuff and you can have more.
Now, is she the author of that book, You're a Badass? Or that?
So the first girl, Jensen Cheryl, is the author of You're a Badass. The second girl is the author
I've read
of,
a good portion of that book.
Yeah, the other girls Meet the Frugal Woods. And so I thought that was really interesting to have two sort of, I didn't mean to have them side by side, but once I went and interviewed this frugal person, I wanted to go interview Jen. And it just worked out that I actually, this is what I do. This is like a little secret. I grabbed the author speaking list from my local bookstore and figured out who was coming into town, and I knew she was passing through. And so I contacted her agent, and I offered her surf lessons, which always helps. And she didn't take didn't take me up on surfing, but she took me up on the podcast interview and dinner, and it was really fun. I learned a ton from Jensen Cheryl, and I highly recommend everyone reading. I like her second book better, You're a Badass at Making Money. You're a Badass is also a great book, but I think for those of you who, one of the things she said that was so important, as an adventurer, I've thought before as a surfer that, you don't need money. You can just like live off the land, which is really romantic in your 20s. I grew up in La Jolla where people have money. That's the truth.
Right.
And money helps you. I mean, she told me something really funny. She said, I've been miserable with money and I've been miserable without money. And being miserable with money is just a lot easier. And I think money isn't a bad thing. I had some stigmas against money because I did grow up in a wealthy area where some kids made some poor decisions because they were so wealthy. And I had to get over those. And I think I'm still working through them. Like, I'm definitely not perfect, but that was a good one. The other interview I think I did recently that was really cool was I interviewed a rock climber who named Beth Rodden, and she was an incredible climber when she was a kid right out of school. And she was married to Tommy Caldwell, who is also like a professional rock climber. And in 2000, they were kidnapped on a climbing trip in Kyrgyzstan. They didn't, it was pre-September 11th. They weren't thinking terrorists on their mind. And they were kidnapped by a group linked to Al-Qaeda. And they went 6 days with like no food. They thought they were going to get killed. Tommy ended up pushing one of the captors over the cliff, thought that he was going to die. He didn't die, luckily. They got away, and she ended up getting divorced. And she talked about being a recovering perfectionist, which I think a lot of people who are in business or elite climbers, they tend to have this perfectionist mindset. I know I had it. I was a runner. I definitely went a year where I didn't eat much and I ran really fast, but I had this perfectionist mindset. And she talked about getting over your perfectionist mindset. That was really helpful. So I like stories about people who've kind of failed and overcome, or have a lesson to teach us that we can apply to our own lives.
And I think it's so interesting. I think the adventure sports, what you said is so true, that they're failing so much as they are succeeding, that they learn a lot of lessons real fast and have to adapt.
Yeah, I might interview that guy, Alex Honnold, the climber who free climbs without any ropes. I mean, if he fails, he dies.
Yeah,
so it will be really curious to see his take on the world. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. I don't know what's going to happen for sure, but
I call that a death wish.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And
that is amazing.
Yeah, I've interviewed a couple of artists recently, and I find them really fascinating as well. I really like interviewing authors because, my background is in writing, and authors are usually really articulate. They have something to say, and they just spent like 2 years researching a subject, so they're really knowledgeable about it. So it's always good to interview authors if you get the chance.
That's really, really good stuff. I want to close it. First of all, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, unbelievable. Tell everybody where they can find your podcast and your website and whatever else that you want to share.
Yeah, my house. Come to San Diego.
Your house. Well, across the beach, just walk back and forth.
Take you surfing here.
You'll find it.
Yeah, just scream Shelby when you're in San Diego. You'll find me. Yeah, you can go to wildideasworthliving, it's a long one, .com, because Wild Ideas was taken, no. wildideasworthliving.com. You can find us everywhere you find podcasts, iTunes. We're at Wild Ideas Worth Living on Instagram, at Wild Ideas Worth Living on Facebook. We're at Get Wild Ideas on Twitter, but I'm not going to lie, I don't really check Twitter. So just check out Wild Ideas Worth Living. And I'm at Shelby Stanger, shelbystanger.com everywhere. It's like Stranger Noir, Shelby Stanger. Just remember Wild Idea, or type in Wild Shelby, you'll find it. REI, and REI has been sponsoring it. And what's cool about REI, just a little plug for them.
Yeah.
They don't offer just gear to get you outside, but they offer adventures. So if you want to learn to rock climb, I just took a rock climbing class outdoors with REI and it was awesome. And then they offer trips. So you can go to you can go climb Kilimanjaro with REI.
That's
I haven't
interesting.
signed up yet, but yeah, they offer great trips and adventures. And so you really don't have to do anything but bring yourself and a good attitude, which is important in adventure.
We'll end it on that. Thanks so much for coming on. I think this
Dave.
interview is going to be out of this world, well received,
So
and
nice.
I can't thank you enough.
Thank you. You guys are awesome. I love football players.
See, there are kind football players out there.
Of course. I mean, come on. I dated a football player in high school. I mean, doesn't everybody? Like, football players are great.
On that note, we'll sign off for Success for Life podcast. I'm Dave Schumann. You can find us, as you do, on every single podcast venue, Success for Life podcast.
You.